are in a climate crisis moment in the sense that we have been consistently burning fossil fuels and releasing CO2 and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And it's leading to enhanced global warming and ocean acidification with cascading impact on species. And so there are big efforts at multiple scales to figure out how to stop emitting to begin with. And now the discussion is pivoting into the direction of how do we remove the carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere already, with a goal of minimizing the damage that's being done.
Creativity and imagination linked with rigorous research is essential for effective conservation science. And that helps us with preserving biodiversity, ecosystems, and ecosystem services. Here at Moss Landing Marine Labs, Dr. Sarah Smith is leading some creative efforts at dealing with the conservation science issue of human-caused climate change.
So I'm part of this group, and this group was formed in response to a report that the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine published almost exactly a year ago. What this report focused on was efforts to use the ocean for CDR, or carbon dioxide removal. And it outlined 6 different approaches. One of them is to add nutrients to the ocean, stimulate a bloom, fertilize the ocean essentially, and encourage the biology in the ocean to sequester carbon from the atmosphere, die, and then sink into sediments, taking that CO2 out of the equation for global warming. There are a bunch of other kind of approaches, seaweed farming being one of them, ocean alkalinity, which involves changing the alkalinity of the ocean to encourage it to absorb more CO2. It's a chemistry reaction. And the National Academy's report is really interesting to see what people are thinking about and who is doing this in all these different spaces. But there were a few key takeaways from this report, which is that emission reduction is not enough. If we stopped burning fossil fuels completely today, then we still have put so much CO2 into the atmosphere that we're going to face warming and kind of impacts from that. And that any of these efforts to use the ocean for carbon dioxide removal should be well researched, and we don't want to make the problem worse by trying to fix it with a geoengineering strategy gone wrong. Another key takeaway from that is that the research should start now, and that research on one of these methods is not an endorsement of the method. I'm going to dive into the details of iron fertilization, but because I believe that research should be done doesn't mean that I think we should fertilize the ocean with iron. So that's kind of a clear takeaway. The technical feasibility, can we actually do this, is only one step, and that the funding mechanisms should be collaborative, international if possible, and that we need R&D on several different approaches. Not any single one of these is necessarily going to be the silver bullet, or we're looking for a silver buckshot. The conversation around whether iron fertilization is a good idea or not is being revived.
Exploring different conservation solutions doesn't necessarily mean endorsing them, but it's the best way to decide which solutions should be endorsed.
There are big regions of the ocean where the productivity of phytoplankton is limited by access to iron. There's plenty of nitrogen around, there's plenty of phosphorus and silica. So it would be kind of like if you came across a big tilled field just ready to grow, the most beautiful lawn you've ever seen, but nothing was growing there. They're called HNLC regions, or high nutrient, low chlorophyll regions, that look like they should support a lot of phytoplankton biomass, but they just don't. And John Martin's hypothesis was that those are limited by iron. And what's exciting about that is that the iron largely comes from terrestrial inputs, aeolian dust inputs. And so there's a link between Earth and the ocean. When Earth heats up and there's a lot of excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the continents dry out, this iron-rich dust can blow into the ocean and naturally fertilize phytoplankton populations, which grow, take the CO2 out of the atmosphere, die, and sink to the bottom of the ocean and sequester it. So in this way, the Earth-ocean system is working in concert to kind of regulate global climate. We have medium to high confidence that it will work, but what's the length of removal if you actually end up sequestering carbon and sending it to the bottom of the ocean or to water masses near the bottom of the ocean? How long does it actually take that CO2 out? The current estimates of durability are for 10 to 100 years, maybe more. There's a potential to remove up to 1 gigaton of carbon dioxide per year, and that's driven by research-based estimates. There is concern for undesirable consequences, the production of nitric oxide gases or cascading impacts on ocean food webs. There are some negative social aspects. There have been some rogue geoengineers in the past that have gone and just dumped iron in the ocean and promised that it improved fisheries without having a lot of validation behind some of those claims. The co-benefits are largely unknown. And then there are just challenges in accounting carbon. We look at annualized rainfall, for example, but it's really difficult to track where all of the water goes, to know exactly how many raindrops fell in different parts of a rainstorm. So that it's sort of like that with carbon too. It's extra difficult when you're doing this out in the middle of the ocean and it's all ship-based. And then here's an unestimated cost. Those are useful metrics to compare something like nutrient fertilization of the ocean or iron fertilization against some of the other possible tools.
Dr. Smith has other interests in phytoplankton as well. Like, what is their fundamental role in maintaining a healthy ocean ecosystem?
Diatoms are some of the first phytoplankton to respond to inputs of nitrogen, particularly nitrate that upwells from deep nutrient-rich water. And so they're really charismatic bloom formers. They're incredibly diverse. Some species of diatoms make toxins, but they're so productive and they form such a significant part of the overall phytoplankton community that they produce about 20% of the oxygen on Earth every year, which puts them on par with the productivity of the rainforests. People often say that they produce, 20% of the oxygen that we breathe. That's not necessarily the case. They produce 20% of the oxygen produced on Earth. Most of that oxygen stays in the ocean. So this is where they fit into the grand scheme of things when we think about ocean food webs. They are part of that big blur, that blob of phytoplankton up here in the left that takes energy in from sunlight. And using nutrients, nitrate, phosphate, silicate, and iron, they fix carbon, inorganic carbon. And that carbon then goes on to feed all of the rest of ocean food webs, or pelagic food webs in particular, and coastal environments as well. But the fate of that carbon can end up in the sediments if it fluxes out and becomes part of the biological carbon pump, where these particles form. They can get grazed on and repackaged and into fecal pellets. Bacteria can break them down and remineralize it into dissolved organic matter. And so we spend a lot of time trying to understand what the different players are in these different pools and how they're mediating fluxes of things like carbon between the atmosphere and the ocean. And all of these linkages really can impact the overall health of the ocean.
Other conservation solutions that are informed by science include aquaculture and biofuels. And plankton have a role to play in both of those topics.
Diatoms have an excessive amount of carbon that they can dump into these lipid droplets. And what's really cool about these lipid droplets, they're full of triacylglycerol, is that they're essentially chemically very similar to fossil fuel precursors. And we can extract these lipids from algae grown at scale, and these can be used as a drop-in liquid fuel replacement for something like fossil fuels in a much more carbon-friendly scenario, because the carbon that they are turning into these oils is carbon that they took out of the atmosphere to begin with. So it makes them a little bit more of a greener fuel. Diatoms are grown at scale, as I mentioned, for biofuel, but they've also been grown at scale for a very long time as a feed for aquaculture. In addition to the chlorophyll and the lipid that they make a lot of high-value polyunsaturated fatty acids like omega-3s that are really useful to feed shrimp and other filter feeders that are in an aquaculture setting.
Medical doctors have a defined code of ethics. You might have heard about the Hippocratic Oath. Now that humans have developed the ability to modify their environments, conservation scientists are working on analogous ethics.
Ken Bissler, who is leading our group, published Guiding Principles, which is kind of a code of conduct to prioritize collective benefit for humans and the environment, to establish clear lines of responsibility to oversee the studies, commit to open and cooperative research, perform evaluation and assessment in an iterative and independent manner. We want to be able to take this sort of effort offline if it's not giving the kind of output that we want, and to engage the public in consideration of these climate intervention efforts. And one of the things I like about this group is that we are not carbon dioxide removal company. The goal is to remain motivated by and driven by the science, to pull ourselves together as scientists to see what we can do and what we believe the ocean can do to help address this kind of accelerating issue of the climate crisis. Diatoms are the first to bloom, and they have a capacity to take up nitrate beyond what they need to use immediately. They have a storage vacuole, and that's called luxury uptake. So that's a trait that allows them to rapidly respond and rapidly outcompete other taxa.